All right, so we're going to talk about genres today. So how do we choose our genre for the writing that we're going to do? But before that, like always, let's talk about the overall topics that we're going to cover today. So we will start with the feedback on assignment 4 from our session 4, like we always do. So we'll start there. Then we will get into main genres of writings. So if you go and search for genres, search Google or look at different books, there is a huge list of genres, and the classification itself is not very consistent. So what I've tried to cover here today is what we're going to be needing for this course, or what's going to be useful from perspective of this course, and covering majority of genres which are going to be useful for you as writers. So we're not going to talk about each and every genres here. Then we will talk about why is it important to understand genres. You might be thinking that, hey, I have this story in my mind. Why can't I just go and write this story? Why do I have to worry about genres? It is more like a theory. Why do I have to know about theory in order to write my story? So we'll get into that, why it is really important to know genres or understand genres. Then we will get in the details of characteristics of few genres. So we will not talk about all because of the time constraint. And then we will talk about how do you choose the best genre that fits, that best fits your story. So if you're writing a story, how do you pick a genre for that story? And again, that question you might be thinking right now, why do I have to pick a genre for my story? So we will get that addressed as well. And lastly, we'll talk about what is your homework assignment 5. All right, so feedback on assignment 4, I will say, thank you everyone, great job. I went through all the assignments, no commenting, no correction this time, because the objective was for you guys to feel your characters and get in the details of knowing them really well. You will continue working on character, and at some point, the character should feel, or your main characters at least, should feel real. You close your eyes, you should be able to imagine your characters. You can see them doing things. You can see them smiling, right? So that is the real goal. And that's why you need to know your characters. So this was an exercise to help you understand your characters better. And hopefully, some of you realized that you were at the very surface of your character. And as part of this exercise, it made you to consider depth of your characters, right? So that was the whole purpose of this exercise. So I've looked at all of the assignments, and I think all of you have done a great job. In some cases, I would say that description was not very subjective, so it was very kind of objective. I would always say, when you're thinking about human aspects, specifically character profiling, think about in a very subjective way. Right. So more description, more you can describe somebody, the better writer you become. So think about that. So that's pretty much as part of assignment 4. I was very impressed with everyone. So with that, I would like to take any questions you have on assignment. I'm sure you kind of got into some sort of challenge answering one or two of those questions. So I'm happy to hear any of those challenges and any questions you might have there.
One of the challenges I faced was having my characters, like, they would be different on the surface, but then when I try to analyze their personalities in depth, they ended up being pretty similar, because I think I projected a little bit of my character traits onto, my personality traits onto them. So how can I make sure that doesn't happen?
Very good question. You said something which happens a lot to writers and generally in life. We expect others to be just like us. That's a fact of life. Interviewing your character, first of all, and interviewing as somebody else, not just another self of you, is a tool that you can use, and then bring in that diversity knowingly. So I talked about, could be your character maybe having an accent, maybe coming from a particular geography, may have some strong likes and dislikes. A lot of that brings your characters to life. So the more diversity you can put in there, and if you're conscious, to your point, about unknowingly making your character, putting some of your characteristics in your character, making your character somewhat like you, then you would like refrain away from this, right? So you won't do that, right? So as long as you're remembering that, that's a good thing as well. But it's a journey, I would say, in the end. So the more you do it, the more it becomes part of your brain. It gets hardwired in your brain. And that's where I say, spend enough time on your character so that you can really see him or her. When you close your eyes, you're seeing your character, right? Because we talked about features, we talked about diversity, we talked about how they behave, act, what matters to them. You should be able to put that all together and see your character. And the second thing I would say, that always be open for change in anything you write. So that includes character as well. We talked about stories evolving differently than how you started. We talked about characters evolving differently than how you started. We talked about plots evolving. So by being open and allowing them a chance to evolve and be different than how you originally thought about them, is a very good way as well to self-realize that, hey, I thought about this character in the constraints of my own opinion. Now this character wants to be somebody else. Let me be open for that. Make sense?
Yes. Oh, and during your explanation, you mentioned like you kind of implied that it was a bad thing to project like yourself onto your characters. So I was wondering, is it okay for that to happen, or do you want your characters to be different?
Yeah. So I just want to clarify there. So it's not a bad thing as long as it works for your character. So you have to isolate yourself from your character. But if you think that there are certain traits that you can make more real, and it won't change the way you're envisioning character or the story, writers always use their experiences, their feelings to build great characters. So definitely, that's always part of it. But where is the line is where you are over, over imposing yourself, your own personality on a character. That's where the line is.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So in the beginning, I thought that adding more like events to the to my story would make it more like interesting. But as I went through, as I completed the assignments, I realized that I like kind of like changed my view of how I saw the story, and instead of adding more events, I thought about like connecting the event that I already had to the next. For example, for like the rising action, I would I in the beginning I put like a ton of events to make it more interesting. But then is it fine if you connect an event to the other instead of packing it up with the things that you realize?
Yes, a great question. My one line answer would be, the only thing that really matters in writing is making it interesting for the reader, period. Right? But you raised a very good point, right? So lot of events versus spending time to develop the ones, fewer ones, in a better way, that they connect really well. And when you say connect, I see that they make sense to the reader. So reader is really enjoying and really anticipating, the things to come, and then is engaged deeply into it, right? So from that perspective, I do think you are the judge because you know your story really well. If you keep always the reader in the sight and do what's the best thing to do for your reader to make it interesting, meaningful, make it in such a way that it is real for the reader, do whatever makes that happen. So if you throw a lot of events, for example, and if you don't really bridge between those events, if you don't make it real for the reader suddenly may come out of your story, right? If it seems abrupt and that abruptness is not intentional, your reader will see it. So all elements of story is really important. You cannot be extremely focused on events. You have to spend time on developing your characters, making plot to be an interesting one, right? Events is also part of it. And then a lot of other things, right? Describing the setting, describing the environment where they live or they're interacting, all of those things have a lot of value to the package that you're delivering to the reader. So this is exactly what I anticipated, and I've been saying in this class that your stories are going to evolve, and by the time you end them, they might be totally different, which is totally okay. Now, I would also say that it depends on what you're writing. So you're writing a short story here, so focus on character development. May not be huge, right? Because you don't have that much of space to develop a character like you have in a novel. But part of the conducting this course, part of the goal here is also to look at you as future novel writers. So writing a story is only to make sure you understand all the concepts. But the real goal is that through this course, you learn everything that you need to write a novel. So just understand that. Don't go too far from short story perspective in any of these dimensions, because the art of short story is that you have to communicate a story in relatively lesser number of words, lesser number of pages. So you need to make your call, what is really important for the readers to know. If you're not writing a novel here, but you would at some point. Make sense?
Like,
Yeah.
can you, so if you didn't have the second main character in the beginning, but as you were doing an assignment, so for example, the main character is exposed to a new setting, and can you like gradually introduce the second, it not as a main character but as like a confidant to like build up the main character's like personality traits and basically
Yeah. Great question again. So that's how it happens for any writer. So they get idea, they start, letting that idea be in their mind for some time, and they start getting some ideas of some characters, some situations, they keep making notes of it. And once after, let's say a while, sometimes could be days, months, or sometimes even years, because people keep idea in mind for good enough time to make sure this idea will have longevity, right? When we talked about idea, we talked about, hey, you need to make sure you have an idea that you can really develop, right? And it may not be apparent immediately when it comes to your mind. You need to let it be there for some time. And part of the reasons we did 3 ideas and pick one was to bring the point home that you just don't develop on any idea. You develop on very few ideas. So you might have 20 ideas, then you pick one that you want to develop on. And writers go through that rigorous exercise to do that. So getting back to your question, so when a writer has an idea, writer starts thinking about mainly plot, characters, events, and what theme is going to be there, background. And often when they start working on, like, okay, now I've been with this idea for a year, 2 years, I think this idea is worth developing. It has longevity, it will appeal to me now onward as well, because it has appealed to me for last 2 years. Right? So once they're at that stage and they start writing or be more disciplined about saying, hey, now I start writing this novel. Earlier it was just, connected things to that idea, I'm jotting here and there. So once they start writing, or when they kick off their writing about, on a novel or a story or a book, they don't have all the characters, and they don't even have all the main characters. They start with what they know at that point. And as they expand their story, there are elements of that story that require new characters, because they can't really make people who they already thought about do everything that comes later that they didn't even know about. And sometimes, believe it or not, number of main characters get introduced. So it is not also about side characters. So the bottom line is, your question really calls out something which is very common for a writer. So this is how it happens. You start with, let's say, 5, 6 characters, or 10 or 20, depends on how complex your book is. And then you add more as and when you feel a need. Now, you have to challenge yourself and say, do I have to? But it happens. It happens all the times. Nobody starts with number of characters that will eventually be the same number of characters. I have not seen that example. Make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So I know this might seem kind of obvious, but when you develop a character, how do you exactly show that to the reader that it's that they're growing or changing, or changing perspective or something?
So there are 2 aspects to it. So one is developing character for you, which is totally a journey of self-searching, analyzing for yourself, how this character should come across to the reader. Now, how you do that is a very different thing. And it all depends on your skills as a writer. And if you remember, I think couple of things I said there, I said any visual things, you can utilize situations, you can utilize other characters to kind of talk about that. When you introduce character, you can talk about a number of visual things. And then when somebody notices some feature of this character, you can build on that. But the other things, the second thing I said for other things which are more on the behavior aspect, on the personalities, you are better off showing, not telling it. So rather than saying person A felt sad for hours, period, you will say person A sat on the bench next to the river, stared at the tree next to him or her for 3 hours, right? Something like that. So you have to show it to the reader rather than telling them. So most of the character development that you would do for reader, or make reader realize that this is the kind of personality this person has, is not through describing in plain English, but through showing it, right? So if somebody is forgetful, you don't say she's forgetful. You basically show it, show 2-3 times, because if that is an important element of the story, and that is something that is driving a very significant event in future, you really want to mentally prepare your reader for that, so that reader would think this is a natural thing to do. And telling reader somewhere that she's forgetful is not the right way to do it. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and it comes with years of writing, years of reading. To be
Because
to be a good writer, you have to be a very good reader. And then other thing I said, always read like a writer and write like a reader. Always remember this.
like, can you just let it naturally happen? Like when you develop the events, like your character kind of develops with it, with the events, because those are kind of the events happening.
Yes. Short answer is yes. That's always the case, right? And you decide what's the best for the reader. There's no other way but to develop characters more naturally. But what you call natural is really the question here. Are you doing it naturally? Is why you need to dabble a bit in the theory and tools and technologies to confirm that part, right? So reading about it, knowing about it, putting some theory around it, taking help of tools and techniques is not coming in the way of naturally developing your characters, right? It is helping you vet that you're doing it naturally, if that makes sense. There is no doubt it has to be in the natural way, but how to do that in the natural way is why we go through thorough understanding of concepts of character development, and we engage in these exercises to know more about our characters so that we can naturally develop them. It's not easy.
Oh, okay. I get it now. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. So let's get going in the interest of time. All right, so main genres of writing. So as you all know, like I said earlier, there are probably many more classifications, and some classifications are based on age group that suits the readers, like young adult, tweens and things like that. What I have here is what I think are the important ones from this course perspective, from perspective of you guys developing novels in future, right? So here are the main ones. I'm not going to be focusing on nonfiction, but I just wanted to show these because you might be wondering at times where are biographies, essays, and things like that. So I've categorized nonfiction ones here as well. In the fiction ones, here are the main ones. We are going to go through them, some of them in next slides, because it's not possible to cover all of them. And I don't really think there is a lot of value in covering like romance, horror ones, and historic ones, because you're much more familiar with the elements in there. They're much more, I would say, they're much easier to understand than the other ones. So before we do that, why is it important to understand genres? I was thinking about how to make a point with something similar, and I couldn't find a better example than thinking about cuisines. And nowhere I've seen anybody describing genres like cuisine. So this is my own way of making you realize why these knowing genres are important. So as you know, different cuisines like Italian, Mexican, Indian, Caribbean, they have different ingredients, flavors, spices, and process of cooking, right? So if you want to cook Mexican food, can you really use Italian recipes? You may, but the person eating it, will that person like it as something that person was expecting? Now, from experimentation perspective, it may be a new thing that you gave rise to in the universe of food, but did it solve the purpose, right? So if you think about genres as writers and readers, why it is important, think about cuisines as a cook and the person who is eating, right? So if you are cooking something and if you don't follow the basic guidelines of that particular cuisine, you are not going to be producing a good result for the person who has come to your shop thinking that that person is going to get a particular cuisine. In this case, Mexican. So if somebody is coming to your restaurant and says, hey, I'm here for Mexican food, and you're using Italian cuisine, Italian recipes to cook it, that person will not be satisfied, right? And you will see the point. I'll take some examples there. But I wanted to make it very simple by taking this example of cuisines. You can always draw this parallel. And it's a complex concept to understand, but I wanted to start here as it may do that beginning in your mind in why genres and understanding of genres is important. So a genre provides a framework to help writer with consistency, making setting or plot believable, and with character development, right? So if you are writing about fantasy, you know your genre is fantasy, you will stick to the rules of that particular genres. Because in fantasy novels, most of the things are unreal, right? So you will do a reality check with yourself when you write it. You say, am I sticking within the boundary of fantasy if I'm writing fantasy, right? And that goes across many elements of writing. So it could be setting, plot, character development, or how interactions happen, how the environment is where they're interacting and things like that. What are the rules, regulations, and things like that. And then it also, in the last bullet here, it also makes you more sure, makes you see definitely what you want to show and what you don't want to show, or how you want to show, how you don't want to show, right? As we get into more in-depth discussion about the genres, we'll take some examples to explain some of these points. So the first genre that we want to talk about is realist fiction. And I have a couple of examples here. So some of you, if not all, I would like to believe all, might have seen the movie Wonder, if not read the novel Wonder. And some of you might have also watched The Fault in Our Stars, or even read the novel. So this genre is set in the real world. It depicts the real world and the society the way it exists. And in this genre, if your story is in this genre, a novel is in this genre, you make the setting very believable in the real world. So if somebody watches a movie in this genre or reads a novel in this genre, would have this feeling that, hey, this could have actually occurred. So most of the stories or novels that are based on real life obviously belong to this genre, but then a lot of fiction is written in this genre as well. By the way, the writer of The Wonder was inspired by a real event that happens, a real story that happened to somebody that he knew. So it was based on a real story. And the story is really about a 10-year-old kid, Augie, whose facial differences leave him in a situation where he has to tackle a lot of issues in real life. And when you think about this story, we think about this can happen to anyone. So there's not a single element in this story which you don't typically see in the real world. And then choice of time and place in this kind of fiction helps us make it real. And a lot of times, this kind of fiction also focuses on contemporary life, things that are going on around us, and common themes in life like falling in love, finding a job, being alcoholic, and things like that. The next one is literary fiction. So this is the, I won't say most difficult form of fiction to write, but I would put it this way. This is regarded as the serious fiction, because this goes in the depths of understanding humans, societies, political environment, and there's a lot of in-depth analysis of the underlying issues, underlying situations, right? And as you can see here, this kind of fiction is regarded to have more literary merit than just being a fiction. So most of the readers of literary fiction, they don't only read it for the story. They read it to feed their brains with ideas, to feed their brains with some analysis. They go back, think a lot about, in a good way, about how certain issues in the society are being handled, right? Things like that. So 2 examples here. To Kill a Mockingbird, you might know this book is very focused on inequality, racial inequality, and injustice. So that theme is predominantly in there. And like I said, a lot of showing than telling. So instead of saying, hey, this is happening, it is being shown in a way it's very interesting, not only interesting for the reader, but makes a reader think deeply about the underlying issue. And literary fiction really changed people, their outlook in life. Because if you have a book, if you're a fiction reader, and if there is nonfiction book on racial inequality, injustice, you might not pick it. But as a fiction reader, you might pick a literary fiction book like this. And then it opens up your mind about things that you've never thought about. So that's the element that is very different about literary fiction. And they're very character driven. So there's a lot of thought analysis, a lot of analysis of what's going around the character, a lot of analysis either by the character himself or herself, or by somebody else of a character, habits, behavior, and things like that. Explores human conditions all the times. Again, anything related to human aspects human interactions, society, political setup, all the conditions are explored. Number of these conditions are explored as part of literary fiction. So again, I will leave you with this. This is called serious fiction. This goes in the depth of understanding the situations deeply, the issues deeply, food for thought for many readers. So look at it this way. The other example I have taken here is Kite Runner. This is also a heavy story, deals with relationship between father son, lot about redemption, theme of redemption, atonement, and things like that. A lot of thinking in the lines what we just talked about. All right. Fantasy. So you guys probably are most familiar with this genre. And I don't want to talk a lot about it. You know, these two examples I've listed here probably by heart. A new universe is introduced to the reader. So fantasy always has a new universe. Things happen very differently than the real world. Universe has its own objects, laws, regulations, forces, races, and creatures, etc., etc. Often includes magical and supernatural elements that don't exist in the real world. But why do we need to know what fantasy genre is really things like these? Because it's very different from real world. You have to show that consistently so that your reader, even though your reader has never seen anything like this or that world, is convinced about it constantly as you go through your story. Needs good deal of explanation so that the readers understand it correctly. So you created a new world, which is very different from the real world. Now the challenge there is, it might be suicidal as a writer if you don't make it apparent to your reader. So the word explanation here is not that you take 2 pages and talk everything about that real world, that imaginary world that you've created. Right? You have to show it. So the word explanation might be misleading here, but the point really is that you need to make your readers be able to touch, feel the world that you've created, right? So that's what it means. Now it has number of sub-genres, couple I have listed here, just FYI perspective, you should know. So fables, personified animals, and supernaturals often deals with moral messaging, themes. Then you know about fairy tales. There once upon a time kinds where there was a king, queen, princess, trolls, dragons, witches, supernaturals. So those two are subgenres of fantasy. And not only, so I've not covered many subgenres here, just because these two are listed as genres in some literature. I just wanted to put them here. But don't think these are the only subgenres of fantasy. Fantasy has a huge overarching reach across many subgenres. Mystery. So this is also very, I think you guys are more familiar than probably some of the other ones. I think in most of the mystery work that authors have done, there is one characteristic which is largely common, which is a crime gets committed, which could be a murder, abduction, disappearance, and that crime has to be solved for, and somebody is really up for solving that crime. An example is Gone Girl. So as you know, some of you might know about that movie, some of you may not. So a married couple is living a blissful life until one day, I think it was 4th or 5th marriage anniversary of the couple, the wife goes missing. And the husband is the prime suspect. So that brings another good point about this genre. It very likely, most likely, most of the times, starts with a very exciting hook. Think about that. Think about a couple living a blissful life, and one fine day, the wife disappears and husband is arrested or is the prime suspect. Hooks you right away. Then usually involve detectives, who go after, chase the solution, and then generally clues are dropped so that the reader feels like he or she is a detective as well, right? So you're watching how clues are dropped, and you're trying to see who really did the murder or committed the crime. And then other very important thing here is, in this genre, often you will get number of people, number of characters in mystery who are suspects as well. And you reveal to the reader enough so that reader can see each one of them potentially being the murderer or person who committed the crime. So it keeps you in that mode till the very end, till the climax. Right? So think about that. Think about the climax for mystery, which is really happening at the end, because otherwise the mystery will not be as effective. So mystery's climax is very much in the end. Thriller. So a good way to think about thriller and why this genre should be different from mystery, for example, it is much broader in the kind of emotions it gives rise to in the reader or the person watching the movie. So it includes a very high degree of suspense and excitement in the person who's watching the movie or reading, surprise, anticipation, and anxiety. So a thriller at all points in time while you're reading a novel or watching a movie has all of this going at all times, right? And this is the edge of the seats kind of genre. So if you talk about realistic literature, you talk about literary fiction, you talk about mystery, you might not be always on the edge of your seat. You might even go and pick, dinner while you're watching it. You might as well get engaged in something else, check your emails. But this one doesn't let you do this because you're so much involved in terms of excitement, surprise, anticipation, anxiety, suspense. You're always at the edge of your seat, right? So thriller does that to you, and it is more about the mood the reader or the moviegoer experiences than anything else. And then the tension builds toward the climax much deeply as you compare with any other genres. It often includes number of plot twists. So you might be thinking this is going to happen, and suddenly the plot changes. So I've listed 2 movies here, The Shining, Bird Box. You might be familiar at least with Bird Box. The Shining is a phenomenal book and movie. In Shining movie, at one point, reader or movie watcher is believed in some help that is on the way, is going to come and is going to kill the bad guy or at least confront the bad guy. And that help comes, but killed in no time. Right? So that was a big plot twist. You're showing something, building anticipation for the reader, and that anticipation is crushed. It doesn't even take a minute for that to happen. And now reader is back to like all the fears and, all other, experiencing all other emotions that reader was feeling before hope was created in the form of that person who was coming to save the family. All right. It often uses literary devices like red herring and cliffhangers. So they're often misleading clues in there. They're often misleading things that make readers think very differently than where the writer is actually going to take the reader. Right? And cliffhangers, like leaving at a point where there's more questions than answers. Generally don't include humor comedy elements. So last thing to do to a thriller is include humor and comedy with due respect with people who like humor and comedy. If you do this, you can imagine what you will do to a thriller. And this is where, again, I would highlight knowing genre and what their characteristics are is really important. So if you're writing a thrilling story, and if you use humor comedy in it, it won't be thriller. It won't serve the purpose or goal. Magic realism. So 2 examples I have here, and I'm going to run probably 5-10 minutes late today. So people who want to drop can drop. And people who can stay can stay. Video is going to be available on YouTube like always, so you guys can come back if you want to drop. So magic realism is a very, very important genre. And I say this for a reason. So think about the realist fiction. Think about things that you want to achieve, but you can't achieve until something out of ordinary happens. But it's not a fantasy. You're writing about the real life. Your story, your book is mostly dabbling in the real world, but you need something of magical sort, some element of fantasy to push some elements in your story, to achieve something that you cannot achieve otherwise in your story. Right? So that's when you make use of magic realism. Now, when you do, even though it may be one aspect or 2 aspects of things that you have to dabble a bit in fantasy world, it changes everything about your story and book. And you have to really, really make sure your story is coming across as magic realism, not realist fiction. Because it can't be, hey, here it is completely real. Now suddenly something magical happens and it's real again. The reality in magic realism has to build few elements where magic realism element seems natural. All right. So I'll give you an example, couple of examples here. So the Green Mile, the movie where this innocent guy is serving, he's an inmate for a crime he never committed. Right? And he has this power, he has a gift of power to heal others. He can heal others. He can heal like things like cancer, severe chronic pain in your body and things like that. And just because of that element, if you think about movie, the music changes, the settings changes, the dialogues change, right? And if you think about book, the author has to set up everything else in a way that is like natural thing for readers to imagine. It's not like, hey, how can this happen? Same thing in Metamorphosis. So I highly recommend you guys reading this story. So one fine day, the protagonist wakes up and sees himself turn into a giant insect on his bed. Now you would think that's a big deal. How could that happen in a real story? There's no fantasy here. It happens. And you know what? He's still thinking about going to office. He's thinking about my boss is going to be angry. I became insect. Now, how can I go to office so that I can finish the work that I have? So that element of reality is there. It is a real story. But the magical element in the story really changes the way other elements are shown so that it is believable, right? It's a classic. I would say this is one of the best creations I've ever read. Obviously, it's translated in English, so it also depends on which translation you read. But this is a great story for any writer to read. How can you convince about something which is totally not natural? How can you convince your readers about it and get them reading a story which is about real life? Right? So that's where it is very important that a lot of real literature needs some elements where certain aspects of the story is to be pushed and can't happen without magic realism. And if I looked at all of your work, I can take one example here, hopefully not putting you on the spot, Olivia, but I would say this is high time for you to consider magic realism for your story. I would tell you why. Otherwise, very hard for you to make the reader convince the reader that a person will stop sleeping because the person is afraid that he or she is going to die in sleep. Because if that person is going to stop sleeping, he or she is going to die anyways, right? So that's where, think about magic realism, think about elements that you can bring in, and it becomes a unique story which reader is not considering as totally real, but this story stands on itself in the universe as something that makes sense, right? So I'm not necessarily saying do that, but I'm saying that's one of the ideas you should consider in making the story more believable. And the characters take these fantastical elements and normal part of their lives. So, like I said, this guy gets up in the morning, he found that he has turned into an insect, but he takes it very normal, right? So rather than saying, oh God, I should not have this existence, call doctor, whatever, he's thinking about how can I get ready and go to office in like next half an hour, right? And he's thinking about everything real in life lying on his bed. So that's the element here, that fantastic elements happen as part of this genre, but characters are very comfortable, conveniently consider them as normal part of their life. All right, science fiction, in the interest of time, I probably will go very quick here. So 2 examples, The Martian, The Time Machine. Hopefully, a number of you might have seen Martian movie. It includes imaginative and futuristic concepts, which are dependent on advance made in science and technology. And themes might be space exploration, time travel, parallel universes. And then the characters take these fantastical elements as normal part of their lives. So there is some parallel with magic realism here, right? So there may be a time travel in one of these stories belonging to this genre, Time travel does not happen in real life, but in your book, in your story, the time travel will be taken as given. So nobody would say, oh, we can time travel now. You just start there, and everybody in the story takes it as a natural thing. Dystopian fiction, three examples actually I put here: Snowpiercer, Ready Player One, Mad Max, Fury Road. Again, portrays societies in a devastating decline. So this is a genre where often we see dehumanization in a very frightening way. So everything good about our society does not exist. We are all on a decline, right? Often explores the dangerous effects of political and social structure on humanity's future. Right? So there is going to be a political force or social structure which is not acting in the benefit of the society. So this one is exact opposite of the genre utopian fiction, which is always focusing on making things right, building perfect worlds. All right, so the last part before we get to assignment. So choosing a genre that fits the best for your story. How do we do that? Right. So the first thing I would say there is pick a story before genre. So you don't decide that, hey, now I would write a fantasy story. You don't decide I want to write a literary fiction. You don't decide that I want to write dystopian fiction. So you pick a story and then think about the elements of your story and think about, based on your analysis, what genre does it align with, so that you can then operate within the confinement of that genre. Now, not all elements will clearly align with one particular genre, and that's where you start discussing, should I change few things about the story, right? Like one example I took earlier. So things you can ask is the story about real situations, real life characters? Does your work go deep into realistically analyzing humans, societies, etc., which is literary fiction? Is your story going to be more believable in a different universe, which is fantasy? Is a story about solving a crime, which is mystery? Is your goal to keep reader at the edge of the seat? Thriller is a story mostly about real world, but you need a few magical, fantastical elements to move the story. Magic realism is a story about a world that's more advanced because of progress made by science. So this is science fiction, sci-fi. Is a story about an imaginary, undesirable, frightening society with a great suffering and injustice. Dystopian. Right? Now, I would also say what you read really influences what you write. So if you read a lot about fantasy, naturally, what you write tends to be in fantasy genre. So think about that, right? What you like, what genres you like, you tend to write in the same genres. So homework for assignment 5. What's the genre of your story? So write this, pick one of the genres we talked about, describe the elements in your story that confirm this genre. So why do you think your story belongs to this genre? Then name any elements that are not fitting the genre you've chosen. So they might be like largely in this genre, but here are 2 or 3 outliers, right? And then the question becomes how to handle those. How are you going to handle those elements? Then we get to that point and say, hey, so how do we handle these points which are outliers to this genre so that your reader is not suddenly coming outside of your story? With that, I'll take questions. And again, whoever wants to drop, please drop. We are running 10 minutes late already, so I won't hold you, but people who want to stay, you can stay and ask your questions.
Hi, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So sorry, this is more for my story specifically. My second question is a little bit more general. Um, so my story, my main character, sorry, Edwin, is actually based off of myself. So I'm just wondering if it might seem unrealistic to another person, but it has firsthand been, well, been experienced in a different way that I made different, but his brain works the same way as mine, and we do the same things, and it's along those lines. I'm just wondering if that poses a problem, because in the character profiling, I specifically added certain details that would hint to why that is happening, such as his counting the cars, so he's very detail oriented, and such as the fact that he doesn't trust anyone's opinion. So even when people tell him he's okay, that doesn't, he in fact wants to think the opposite. And also, if he misses one night of sleep, then if you miss one night of sleep, you're more likely to miss more nights of sleep, because then you're tired and you're more emotional. And yeah.
So great question. I would say that the example I took was to explain magic realism. And like I said, last thing I want is to force, any element on your story, right? So you understand your story, depth of it. The question I would ask as a reader, put yourself in the shoes of a reader. So a reader will ask you that question and say, hey, so if this guy doesn't sleep, anyway, this guy is going to die, right? So what are you going to do to convince the reader in a good way about this? And one thing could be, one of 1,000 things you can do is that this guy really answers that question before reader asking it, right? So this guy does a lot of research on the topic and is highly convinced, and you have to show that in the story, right? So you have to first understand what questions readers will ask, what will be like unreasonable things to readers reading the story. And that question came to my mind, and you can address that by showing that this character did a lot of research to prove to himself that not sleeping will not lead to bad outcomes, right? So he can still avoid sleeping and be living. So some sort of like, hey, so here is 2 things you can do and you won't have to sleep. So they will nullify the effect on your body of not sleeping, something of that sort, because it's known, it's like, a scientific fact that you need sleep to be living. And if he's going against the scientific fact, then you really need to address that. And that's where, if you think about this, you get into a little bit into different genre here, right? So either you go in the, a little bit of literary fiction where you're overanalyzing his psyche, his personality, his internal thinking, or you go into magic realism, creating some elements, right? And maybe, he's talking to himself a lot, right? He's created a world around himself. So it's up to you. But my point was more about, you have to ask those tough questions from reader's perspective to yourself as a writer, and ask yourself, are you giving me enough to believe this? But totally fine. If you can convince the reader, you can do anything. And that's where the art is. Like I said, Franz Kafka convinced the reader of somebody turning into an insect and still be thinking about going to office, getting ready. It's where how powerful writer you are really shows. So very challenging assignment, but it requires a lot of dabbling into reader's mind. And be reader and read your story. Ask yourself questions Like, does this happen in real life? Because you know the character, and it goes back to what I've been saying earlier in the course. You know the character, you can really feel the character, you can really understand what character is doing, but it's not really you in the end that matters. From feeling perspective, yes, but from describing perspective, is the reader who really matters in the end. Can you bring that picture lively in front of the reader and convince the reader? That really matters.
Okay, sorry, I just have a follow-up question. What if our stories don't really fit any of the listed genres? Like, because personally, I don't really like fantasy or magic-y. I just don't really, I only have interest for stories that have a strong theme, or stories that have some sort of strong element to them. So what if it fits more of like a different theme, a different genre, like drama or tragedy or something a little bit more specific?
That's totally fine. And there's a movie called Machinist. I don't know if you heard about that movie. So that movie is about this guy who can't sleep. Right. So I think they've done a very good job with that. I don't know the rating, but I think they've done a very good job in developing that character. And there is something behind his inability to sleep. Right. And they don't even touch the topic of him even thinking that if I'm not sleeping, am I doing a damage to myself? Right. So totally. And I think that genre for that would be realist fiction still. So you don't have to use magical elements, fantasy elements. I'm not big on fantasy as a writer myself, but I dabble a little bit in magic realism. But I totally understand your point of view.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. What other questions you guys have?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, for example, if you're doing like a mystery themed story, then if you're like revealing a certain structure or part of your story, would it necessarily be good to put it in the climax section, or reveal it as the story ends? Because that could kind of go both ways, since if you're trying to create suspense, but you have to also make sure to have a following action and resolution.
Great question, Teshri. I would say there's no yes or no answers to this question. The reason is it depends on the story. It depends on the journey you have taken reader through. It depends on the very characteristics of what you're going to reveal. It depends on how you want to end the story, right? So it depends a lot on those aspects. So some mysteries, they reveal a lot in the climax. They still continue. There's, some follow-on action after that, but some goes on the cliffhanger, right? And some just last scene, everything flashes to the movie watcher or book reader. Last page is where everything becomes clear, literally, right? So I think it all depends on the kind of work, kind of story you're putting together. It also depends on your personal take at how you would like to treat readers' experience. Because in the end, like I said, nothing else matters. Readers' satisfaction is the only thing that matters to a writer. So as long as you can read your story as a reader and make a good judgment about where exactly to reveal what, go with it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sorry, following that question, so if you were to just like reveal it at the climax, like do you have to write the following action and the resolution? Like, could you just like end it there at the climax, or?
So simple answer to that is stories don't necessarily follow the constraints of frameworks, structures, and all that. Like I said in the beginning, that was a framework that most stories follow. So we talked about that from perspective of this course so that you can learn and build a lot of fundamentals on a basic thing that we can all be consistent about. But to answer your question, again, look at it this way. What makes your story the best way to tell your story, right? And do that, just do that. So it could be the last scene, it could be 5 minutes before that, it could be in the middle, right? You have to experiment. A lot of times authors go through a lot of changes in their writing, and believe me or not, sometimes their last scene becomes their first scene in the end, and they always worked on it for months, years, and in the end they decided, hey, why don't I put this in the beginning itself, right? So you will go through all of that. You have to think about a lot of what if scenarios. You have to think about moving different sections, revealing different things to reader at different point of time, and 5 options, which one would be good. And then you have your early readers, where you can even give it to your friend or somebody else and say, hey, I thought about 5 options. These 2 are I'm debating which ones will impress reader the more. Right? So authors go through all of that. It's not easy, but I would say you need to experiment a lot. You need to try out 2-3 versions and see which one as a reader will make you more satisfied.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, I know we are much beyond time today here, so appreciate everybody's flexibility to stay on. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good rest of your weekend, and good night to the person from India, and have a great rest of the day, everyone else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.